The dreaded Dunkelflaute. Those times when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing for days at a time. For grid operators who are relying on wind and solar to power homes and businesses, this is the stuff that keeps them up at night. This is what keeps fossil fuel plants on the grid. Today on Decarbonize, we're going to look at how a future Ireland powered entirely with wind and solar could keep the lights on even during the worst days of the year. The good news is this is very much a solvable problem, and the best solution is probably not what you think. This is just a rough analysis, so I'm going to make some assumptions to simplify everything. One of the assumptions is that I'm not worrying about variations during a day. Solar not producing at night, wind not producing when the air is calm. By the time we hit 100% renewables, we will have plenty of storage to fill the valleys during the day, which would be about 3 gigawatts of power and 48 hours of storage. As there are already 3 gigawatts of battery projects in the pipeline and 4 hours of storage for each battery is already the norm, this is a reasonable assumption. The concern is Dunkelflaute, when the wind and solar production is low for days at a time. This requires much more storage than just powering the night with daytime solar. In addition to electricity produced in Ireland, we also have 3 interconnectors that allow the Irish grid operators to trade power with Britain. And in 2028, we'll have our first interconnector to France. The 4 cables in total will be able to transfer 2.25 gigawatts, which is almost half of the electricity we currently use in Ireland. So to keep our grid running, we'll have a little help from our friends. I'm assuming we'll always be able to get power from France and Britain, which I've talked about in this video. Something that's easy to confuse is the difference between capacity and average power produced. The capacity is the power an asset can produce in peak conditions. Onshore wind farms only produce power about a quarter of the time, so the average power is 1/4 of its capacity. Solar in Ireland has a low capacity factor of about 10%. This factors in weather and night. In this video, I'll be using average power, as that considers the capacity factor and the amount that's been deployed. I'm not trying to describe the grid as it is today or will be soon. Currently, renewables supply 44% of the electricity, so it's going to take a while to move that to 100%. The goal is to be 80% renewables by 2030, and the last 20% is the hardest. So think of this as the grid we could have in 10 years. So let's start by describing my hypothetical situation and look at the worst days. And then we'll move on to solutions, both the bad ones and the good ones. In the future, the Irish grid has to deliver 5 average gigawatts every day, which is only a bit more than it does today. Sometimes it might be higher, maybe 6 gigawatts, and sometimes lower, like 4 gigawatts. But averaged over the course of the day, it's 5 gigawatts. The reality is certainly going to be higher than this, but all of the logic scales to whatever load is actually seen. Currently, the Irish grid gets a significant amount of electricity from wind and a bit from solar, but solar is growing faster. For this analysis, I assume that the future grid will be half wind and half solar, and averaged over the course of the year, they will combine to produce 5 gigawatts on average. I downloaded the data on the actual production from wind and solar from our grid operator, AirGrid, over the last 13 months, and I'll assume that the future wind and solar production will follow the same curve, just more of it. 2.5 gigawatts of wind, we only need 50% more than we currently produce, which is easily doable. Solar will have to increase by a factor of 17, which is easier than it sounds because solar power just hasn't been a player in the Irish grid until recently, but is now growing quickly. We can certainly build out more than enough renewables by 2036 to deliver much more than 5 gigawatts averaged over a long time period. Our goal just for offshore wind is 5 gigawatts of capacity by 2030, which will have an average production of about 2.5 gigawatts. So just offshore wind could replace what we currently get from gas and bring us up to 100% renewables. For the normalized curve, we can see easily that solar power is summer peaking and it's quite low in the winter. and wind power is winter peaking, but the seasonal impact is less pronounced. This is why a grid with both wind and solar is much less susceptible to Dunkelflaute than one with just wind or solar. A solar grid would be impossible in the Irish winter, and a wind-dominated one would be less robust in the summer. Looking at the solar plus wind production, any day where the average power generated is less than 5 gigawatts, but more than 2.75 gigawatts can be managed with imports from Britain and France. But there are several days where the average daily production drops below 2.75 gigawatts, where just daily storage and imports would be insufficient to keep the lights on. The worst period was in October, so let's look at that month in detail. From October 10th through the 16th, the production is below 2.75 gigawatts, with the lowest on the last day of the period at just under 1 gigawatt, a shortfall of 4 gigawatts. So what tools can AirGrid bring to bear to keep the lights on? The current solution to this problem is to have fossil fuel gas power plants available to turn on during these periods, and that's okay for now. But as renewables become a bigger and bigger part of the grid, these plants will turn on less and less and become a cost that doesn't add much value most of the year. I believe there are better solutions, as I discussed in this video. Some argue that this is why Ireland needs nuclear power, but I don't believe that's a good solution for us, as it will take at least 20 years to build a nuclear power plant in Ireland. If you don't believe me, look at how long it's taken to build our second offshore wind farm. And that's much less controversial. If people are interested in a video on why I don't think nuclear makes sense for Ireland today, let me know in the comments. There are 5 elements of a solution to Dunkelflaute. These are solutions that work, not just here in Ireland, but anywhere. All of these solutions use technology that's available today and can be implemented on a timescale of years, not decades. And several of these technologies are improving rapidly, so the cost will be coming down. And they're all good enough right now. The first is to overbuild. My model was to build just enough wind and solar to meet our needs averaged over a year, to import as much as we export to help balance the grid. But if we overbuild our wind to an average of 5 gigawatts rather than 2.5 gigawatts, the situation looks much different. Now, even during the worst month, we have enough power to meet our demand when we add imports from our interconnectors with no need for additional storage. Since Ireland's target is to have an additional 5 gigawatts of capacity from offshore wind by 2030, this is consistent with our current plan. So this most important solution to Dunkelflaute is scheduled to be online by 2030. I don't expect we'll hit that target, but by 2036 we certainly will have. I wouldn't overbuild solar, as the periods of Dunkelflaute happen in the winter when solar isn't productive. An optimal system would probably have less than 2.5 average gigawatts of solar that I've modeled here. This makes Ireland an electricity exporter and less dependent on Britain and France than we currently are. Another tool is to build more interconnectors, preferably to France and Spain, where the cost of electricity is low and their weather is not correlated with the Irish wind. There are 2 more interconnectors to Britain in the planning phase. I just have a bit of concern with the interconnectors to Britain, since periods of low wind in Ireland might also create a low wind situation in Scotland, putting pressure on the British grid. On the other hand, Britain has a lot of interconnectors to the continent and a more diverse energy supply that includes nuclear. So it would probably be okay. The third is to upgrade our grid so that dispatch down or curtailment doesn't occur as much. This happens when electricity that can be produced goes to waste because of congestion on the grid, or there's just no customer for it. The batteries and interconnectors mentioned already are part of that solution, but it's also just more wires where they're needed. Just like the other solutions, this is something that's happening. Up till now, we've only talked about short-term storage that is enough to smooth over the peaks and valleys over the course of the day. What about long-duration storage? Most people probably think this is the primary solution, but in fact, I think it's the least important so far. But it's not to say that it isn't a good tool. An example of this is the Form Energy battery that is planned for Ireland. These batteries are less expensive than lithium batteries, so it's financially acceptable to leave them charged on most days and only resorting to them on extreme conditions like October 2025. Another example is the Rat Rush Green Energy Park, which will take excess electricity to make hydrogen, which is then stored in large underground tanks. When power is needed, the hydrogen will be used to generate electricity. But the problem with relying on batteries is if you build enough for 4 days, you're screwed if the Dunkelflaute lasts for 5. A final tool is demand response, and not the routine charge your EV in the early morning I talked about in this video, but more drastic demand response like what Ireland already has, where large industrial customers turn off high energy consumption machinery during a challenging time for the grid. Since this reduces the bottom line of these companies, it should only be done in the most extreme of conditions, but it's better than rolling brownouts. None of these require any new organization or laws. It's just doing more of what we're already doing. No new technologies are needed, but cheaper batteries and floating wind turbines will help. Following this approach will transform Ireland from a net electricity importer to a net exporter. This will happen over time, just following our current plans. More wind, solar, and batteries every year. And the gas plants that we have will operate less and less. But as I stated, we're already past the point where we should be building new gas plants because in just a few years they will be sitting idle. How much is this going to cost? Not all that much. Everything I'm suggesting we do has already been commercialized and is coming down the cost curve. Solar panels are getting cheaper, offshore wind is getting cheaper, batteries are getting cheaper. The only way to reduce electricity bills is getting gas off our grid. Let me know in the comments if you want to know why. Many of the assumptions I made are demonstrably wrong. The grid of the future will require more power than the one we have today. There are losses in the system. There is curtailment and dispatch down. But the primary story, that we can build a grid on just renewables that keeps the lights on, holds even with a more realistic model. Dunkelflaute is a real thing, but it just needs to be managed intelligently, not used as an excuse for doing stupid things like building gas-fired power plants in 2026. If you think I got something important wrong, please let me know in the comments. You can support the channel by buying me a pint or a YouTube thanks, or watch more of my videos on energy storage. If you've learned something, please like and subscribe. And please share this video with everyone you know who has had to figure out how to manage days where they just don't have the energy they need.